Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Well, it should end in just a second. All right, good evening. Miss Jane's got the right idea. Let's go ahead and stand, and we're going to sing not as common a song that we've sung, but He is able to deliver thee. 'Tis the grandest theme through the ages rung, 'tis the grandest theme for a mortal tongue, 'tis the grandest theme that the world e'er sung. Our God is able to deliver thee. He is able to deliver thee. He is able to deliver thee. Though by sin oppressed, turn to Him, we're blessed. Our God is able to deliver thee. Minnie, can you hit the mouse on the computer, please? I think it got moved off of Proclaim for some reason. So sorry about that. That would be my fault from earlier. Yes. Maybe not. We are locked up? Here, y'all just shut Proclaim down and start it back up. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Y'all go ahead and be seated. So we will skip verse 2. So we're going to be in Exodus chapter 1 and chapter 2 this evening, and going to start in a new series of something I've wanted to do for a while, of Excavating Egypt. Going to be looking at the events of Exodus with the 10 plagues and how those connect to the different gods that the Egyptians worship. You know, the plague against the Nile, how they worship the Nile, plague against frogs, how they had a frog god, and so look at that. And this is something that Pastor Howard alluded to a couple weeks ago when he was talking about Hagar, going through his Genesis series, how Hagar was from Egypt, and so she would have had many of those similar ideas. So it was neat how I'd already had this in the works, and so this will kind of be a complementary idea to his series. So I've been going through this book, pretty good, called Moses and the Gods of Egypt, classic book on this topic, and a little bit weighty, a little bit technical, so I'm trying to read through and boil it down to understandable stuff for church people. So get that going for y'all. And but if you want to read it on your own, that's certainly something you can pick up. And so as preliminary, tonight we'll be looking at the beginning of the events in Exodus chapter 1, chapter 2, before we get into the 10 plagues, and what takes place, and see how this fits into what we know as far as archaeology today, and what we understand about Egypt and those time periods. So some things about archaeology. It's very limited. It's not at all like people think. From the movies, Indiana Jones and National Treasure and stuff like that, that is complete baloney, sadly. And so archaeology is very, very limited. And we'll talk about some of those limits as we get started here. One thing about archaeology is that dates are flexible. So when you dig stuff up, they don't have labels on it. Like, well, I'm from 1400 BC or whatever. It doesn't say those things. And those people used completely different calendars back then anyways. So there's no way to tell exactly. Archaeology uses lots of assumptions, and those assumptions will change, and those things will get updated as new information comes along. So the most common way to date things for archaeologists today is that they use pottery. They find different kinds of pottery styles, and like, well, this was the Mycenaean pottery style, so that puts it in early Bronze Age, and this was this other pottery style, and that's helpful, but it has lots of flaws with it. So, for instance, cities like Jericho, they will start digging in one part of town, and when they start digging, they don't know where they are. Are we in the rich district? Are we in the poor district? So if they start in the poor district, they find just a few samples of pottery. Well, this must be like 1200 BC or something like that. Well, then later they dig in the rich district, and they find more samples of pottery because the rich people could afford pottery from farther away. And so that changes the whole dates. We're backing this up a couple hundred years, and so it changes those things around. As one true archaeologist said, hey, if you're within 50 years plus or minus, you're doing good. You're doing good. So anything with the Bible, anything as far as like when we try to peg dates down with our time, especially stuff like the Exodus, that we're talking 3,400 years in the past from where we are today in 2023, there's wiggle room, certainly, in there. Cultures like the Egyptians kept very accurate astronomical records, so things like eclipses and comets. And so we're able to use our knowledge today to go back in time and figure out, okay, there would be an eclipse around this time, but that still only gets you within 20 years, plus or minus. So that can help, but it's not super precise like people think it is. And so when you go back to these really long dates, you kind of have to assume things about earlier dates, and then you jump off from there. And so the key for our current understanding of the events of Exodus comes from actually the book of Kings, 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. This talks about when Solomon is going to start building the temple, and it gives us a number here. It says, "And it came to pass in the 480th year, after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord." Okay? So that verse is saying as soon as the first year Solomon started the temple was exactly 480 years after the events of Exodus had taken place. And so we kind of know when the temple and when David and Solomon, when those times were, that King David, it's real easy to remember. You just think 1000 BC. In our timeline, 1000 BC, that's when King David reigned. And so Solomon, in BC, you go backwards from our time. So David reigned 40 years. So you take off 40, you get to 960 or so. That's when Solomon begins his reign. And so then in the next year, in the 4th year, as it says, is Solomon's going to begin on the temple. So around there, so this particular chart has 967 as the assumption as when the temple was constructed. So you rewind 480 years before that, that's going to put you in 1446, 1447, somewhere around there, BC, approximately, for the events of the Exodus. And but again, nothing is super precise. The Bible calendars of those times, the Jews used a lunar calendar, which was 360 days. So that doesn't line up with 365 days for a solar calendar. So that gets off after you do a bunch of years there. So again, there's wiggle room with all of these deals. What the Bible says is absolutely true, and when it says these numbers, those are absolutely true. How we figure them out according to our calendar, we're still working on it. Some things we'll never 100% know until we get to heaven. But we know with our understanding, with this timeline, Moses, the Exodus, that's going to take place in what secular history calls the 18th dynasty of Egypt. And we'll kind of look broadly at that and see what's going on there. Another thing about archaeology is it makes assumptions using fragments. Okay, movies like Indiana Jones are very entertaining, where, wow, he goes to Tibet and he finds this one medallion over here. And then he goes into this one place in Egypt and it lines up exactly on this staff and the sun shines through and it points exactly where the Ark of the Covenant is going to be hidden. Baloney, okay? That's not how it is at all. You have things that have been buried for thousands of years that they're perfectly going to fit together. No, not whatsoever. The way real archaeologists work is they have a little snippet of something over here, and they have a little snippet of something over here, and most of the time those don't match up whatsoever, and you just kind of got to pick and choose which one you like best. And as one guy, he was a British archaeologist, as one guy said, archaeology is like trying to figure out how the British government works, parliament, prime minister, how does the British government works by rummaging through the trash cans of a couple secretaries. which is kind of like it is. A lot of archaeology, they dig up people's trash. They dig through wells and stuff where people threw away things. And so, yeah. And so with that, a lot of times you'll hear things like, oh, well, the Bible's wrong on this, or the dates in the Bible don't line up with that, this thing that we know in academia. Well, those dates are flexible, and also there have been many a time that what has been taught where the Bible has been wrong as archaeology updates with more evidence has been found, the Bible was right the entire time. So, for instance, the Bible mentions a lot about these people called the Hittites, Uriah the Hittite and other Hittites here. Abraham bought a cave from the Hittites. Over and over, the Hittites. Well, for years, it was taught in academia, well, the Bible's dead wrong. There's no such thing as the Hittites. They never existed. No, never around whatsoever. And taught just by the authorities. Well, turned out the Hittites were real, and they found their capital city, and they found a whole library from the Hittites. And a couple years ago, I watched a 3-hour documentary on the Hittites. And you can, at New York City today, where they have the United Nations building, outside the plaza where you first walk into the United Nations building, there is a relic, and it is the world's oldest peace treaty. And it's saying, we want to encourage nations to have peace with one another. And that peace treaty is between the Egyptians and the Hittites. Yeah. So it is real, and they were there. The Bible was right the entire time. Other stuff like the book of Daniel says that the Belshazzar, the Nebuchadnezzar was actually his grandson, had a feast, and the handwriting on the wall. And in Belshazzar, when the Persians come and take over Babylon, and Babylon falls. Well, for years and years, that the records that we had said that had nothing about this Belshazzar character. Well, Nebuchadnezzar, his son, was named Nabonidus. Nabonidus was the last king of Babylon. Every historian, Tacitus, all the main historians, they say Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon. The Bible's wrong. The Bible's dead wrong. Till I think it was like 80 years ago, they found a cave over there in the area of Babylon, and they found in there a scroll, and they interpreted it, and it was a prayer from Nabonidus, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, and he said he's praying to the god of Babylon, and he's praying for his son, Belshazzar. So yes, the Bible is right. The Bible is always right there with that. We just have to wait, and the evidence will come around there. So, but yeah, there's just very limited pieces of what they have to work with. And then letter C with what we find in archaeology is that it is propaganda. It is very slanted one way, pro whoever is the person in charge at that time. So these temples, these hieroglyphs, these carvings, those are extremely expensive to build. So therefore, the only person who can have them built is the state. They're the only ones who can afford it. And so if the state is footing the bill, guess who gets to choose what gets written on there? The state. And if Pharaoh is not only in charge of the state, if Pharaoh is worshipped as a god, which y'all remember, these are the same people when they uncovered some of the pyramids and stuff, what was at the door? There were skeletons of their servants and of their wives who were buried alive because you needed to take all this stuff with you into the afterlife. And so these are the kind of people, you're not going to criticize them. You're not going to write anything down. You're not going to chisel anything that is speaking against the state, or in the Egyptian view, it would be a blasphemy against their God. And so you'll hear things like, oh, well, there's no archaeological record of the Exodus. There's no tablets that talk about 2 million people leaving and slaves escaping from Egypt. Well, of course you're not going to find something like that. No one is ever going to dare pay for something bad press to be spoken of about them. Of course, it would be highly unusual to find anything in that regard whatsoever. So we shouldn't be surprised at that in any way. That, in fact, the more things change, the more they stay the same, sadly, there with the propaganda and what goes on. So with that, though, let's look at the book of Exodus. So Genesis ends with that all of the people of Israel have come down to live in the land of Egypt, that God had raised Joseph up to be number 2 underneath Pharaoh and had established good things for his people, and there was a good relation between the Hebrews and the Egyptians at first. However, that's going to change with their enslavement as we get into Exodus chapter 1, verse 8. It says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph." Now, the phrase there says new king over Egypt. That's the idea of an outsider that comes in. So not someone from within who is raised, the son of the Pharaoh, an idea of an outside force comes in over the land of Egypt. And with our understanding of archaeology and history, that's going to be these people called the Hyksos. The Hyksos, so they're going to come in. These are the people who invent chariots. And so they have military technology that's going to give them the edge to conquer Egypt. They're also going to have other technology like the compound bow, a bow made out of multiple materials, horn and sinew. And so that's going to shoot a lot farther than just the plain wooden bows. And other technology, you combine that with horses, chariots, bows, everything. They're going to be very cutting edge at that time. And so they're going to be able to conquer the land of Egypt. And so by being outsiders, they won't have any respect for Joseph or for the policies of previous Egyptian rulers. So, of course, they wouldn't care about that, and therefore they're going to enslave the Israelite people. And so there's a hieroglyphic picture there of the Hyksos invasion, them coming in with their chariots. And I know it's kind of hard to see, but that chariot wheel has 6 spokes on it. That number 6 is going to be important later when we look at the Red Sea and the potential crossings there. And so the Hyksos, they come in. And so Egypt is not a entirely unified country all at once. And Egypt has a really long history here, and that's what we have to remember. Thousands of years, of which Israel was only 430-ish of that time. And so during their enslavement. And so with this, the Hyksos are only going to take over the northern part of Egypt. You got the Nile River going up to the Mediterranean Sea, and it branches out. It's called the Nile Delta, right before it gets to the Mediterranean. And so the Hyksos are going to take over that northern strip, the Nile Delta, the best part, but the native Egyptians, they're going to flee to the south. They're going to be still continuing on with their dynasties down there while the Hyksos control up in the north. But that was where the Hebrews were. That's where the Israelites had lived, in the land of Goshen, in the Nile Delta. So verse 9... and the Bible doesn't name the Hyksos people, but it really fits with what is communicated here. Verse 9 says, "And he said to his people," so the king of, we're assuming the Hyksos, said, "Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us Hyksos deal shrewdly with them, lest they, the Israelites, multiply, and it happen in the event of war that they also join our enemies," the Egyptians down to the south, the proper Egyptians, lest they join with them, fight against us, and so go up out of the land. And so the Hyksos are worried, hey, we're the new invaders, new kid on the block. If the Israelites ally with the Egyptians that we ran out, if they ally together, we're not going to stand a chance. So let's oppress the Israelites, therefore they can't ally with the Egyptians, and we can be safe. Here, that was their policy. So they begin this enslavement here as it picks up in verse 11. It says, "Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses." So they put in taskmasters, and these are going to be chain gang type workers, that they're going to break up the families of the Israelites and put them into work parties to be in these buildings, and we'll talk about that in a second. It says they built for Pharaoh. So the Hyksos assume the kingly titles of the Egyptians. They built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. So these are real places that are named in the Bible. We don't know 100% where they are exactly. There's a couple different guesses. But with the evidence we have today, the best understanding is that this Pithom, that's what's later called the city of Heliopolis. And that's the city of the sun, what that refers to, where the Egyptians had a major temple to their sun god, Ra, Amun-Ra. And so there's a computer-generated idea of what Heliopolis looked like in its prime. We have the ruins today of those temples and the other monuments around it. And so these would be, as it says, supply cities. So these are cities of military value, that they've got stores of weapons, stores of food, anything for any kind of national emergency that's there. So they force the Israelites to build here Pithom or Heliopolis, and so not only are the Israelites being enslaved, but to add insult to injury, they're being enslaved to build temples to a false god. That's pretty bad there to support the religion of your enslavers and your oppressors. However, verse 12, but the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were in dread of the children of Israel. So Python, or Pythom, there are Heliopolis, that other city, Ramses, our best evidence that we have for that points to what's later called P. Ramses, or means the house of Ramses, or before, when the Hyksos first came in, it's the city of Avaris. And that is, I see on the map there, a little bit small, but on the most easternmost branch of the Nile Delta, the one farthest over here, you can see the little dots, that's where Avaris would be. So that was the capital city of the Hyksos, and that would make sense. They come in, they enslave these people, and we're going to force them to build our new capital city. Later, when the Egyptians reconquer, they're going to keep it and expand it as their capital city. And there's, again, a computer-generated image, what it would have been like in its prime. Pi Ramses was built upon an island there in the middle of the Nile Delta, and had tons of canals, elaborate watering systems of transportation, all kinds of things. It's called, by archaeologists, it's called the Venice of ancient Egypt. So quite an elaborate city going on there. So that you can see what they would use this slave labor to build these grand creations just like this. And and that was true during that time. Now, a couple hundred years later, after the Exodus, the Nile River is going to shift, and Avaris and those places are going to be completely dry. But yet, the Bible tells that these things happened when they did, and when the river was there at that time. And so the Hyksos, they're going to rule for about 100, 150 years. We don't know exactly. The records are pretty scarce at that time. But this phrase in verse 12 is going to come up several times, that the people, they're afflicted, but they multiply. And so that gives the idea some time has gone by, that events happen, but yet a couple generations multiply, and the people are blessed. And then more oppression happens, and a couple people multiply with more generations. So we'll see that several times in chapter 1. There in Genesis chapter 47, verse 11, talking about when Joseph brought his family to Egypt, it uses that word Ramses. So Ramses was the name of a couple pharaohs. It was also the name of this town and the name of the region. Verse 11 says, "Then Joseph situated his father and his brothers, gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land," so the most fertile land, best for animals and crops, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. And so that's what the Hyksos do. But then the Hyksos are going to be driven out of Egypt, and we'll see that. So verse 12 says the people multiplied, some time goes on, and then verse 13, it says that, so the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor. So it is shifted. Now the Egyptians are back in control. So before it was a king from outside, a king who would come over Egypt. They get driven out. And then now the Egyptians, they continue on the oppression of the Israelites. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor. They made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and brick, and all manner of service in the field, and all service which they made them serve was with rigor. So the Egyptian pharaoh Ahmose the first, he's going to, from down in the south, he's going to conquer over the Hyksos, kick them out, reunify Egypt, and he's going to start what's called the 18th dynasty. And that's going to be all these things, Moses, Exodus, everything's going to take place during the 18th dynasty, from what academia calls it. And so they're going to continue on the enslavement that the Hyksos had started. It says in verse 14, they made the lives of Israel bitter with hard bondage, mortar, brick. And so these building projects, building these cities, making mortar and brick and everything there. The climate of Egypt, very similar to Arizona. We're no strangers to the desert here that we know. So this is outside construction work year-round, very little moisture except where the Nile is, very little rain. And so, but it also says there, in all manner of service in the field, in verse 14. So in Egypt, you've got three seasons to growing crops. You've got the flood season, when the Nile floods, and then you've got the growing season, and then you've got the harvest season. So what the Egyptians wanted to do is they wanted to expand as many irrigation places as possible. Therefore, when the Nile flooded, it would water as much land as possible, and they could grow as much crops. And so the historian Josephus, even though he lived after Jesus' time, when he records the whole history of the Jews, he mentions when they were in Egypt, they were forced to dig irrigation canals, and that fits right in with how the Egyptians farmed back during that time. And so we can see, just all this fits together with what we know and what the Bible says. Now, it's very common if you watch movies like The Ten Commandments or The Prince of Egypt or these epic films, it's going to show the people of Israel building the pyramids, building the Pyramid of Giza and the Sphinx and all that. That's probably not accurate there. That it's very likely the pyramids and those things, those were built way back, like in the 4th dynasty of Egypt. So very likely when Joseph and his family showed up in Egypt, the pyramids were a couple hundred years old already at that time. So, but there's still plenty of things else left for them to build there in the time of Egypt. And very likely, though, you got Noah and the ark, and then after the ark, you've got the Tower of Babel, and then God confuses the languages. And so very likely a few generations after the Tower of Babel, those are the people who build the pyramids, probably using some of the same technology that they were trying to use back in the Tower of Babel in that time. And so, but they get to work building, and so now the Egyptians begin this new phase of oppression called, it's the Hebrew, the genocide. They want to kill them, not just enslave them, but to eradicate them completely. So we see verse 15. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah and the name of the other Puah. And so he's going to tell them, hey, when there's a Hebrew girl, when she's giving birth, if it's a male child, kill him. So he wants essentially the Israelite medical system to enforce this genocide is what they want to do starting off. And it says that the king of Egypt did this. So I've got here a list. These are the pharaohs, male and one female pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. Again, dates are flexible. We don't know who exactly, who was precisely the one that rescued Moses, who was the one Moses ran away from. We don't know. We're just going to look at some of these here, but these events took place sometime during this reign of these people. And so who is this king of Egypt in verse 15? We don't know. Maybe it was Ahmose the first who got rid of the Hyksos. Maybe it was his son, Amenhotep the first, perhaps. The Bible doesn't say precisely there. But we see again this phrase in verse 20. So the midwives do not obey this immoral command of Pharaoh to murder their own people, but they refuse that. And God blesses them, verse 20. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mightily. And so again, that phrase, there's multiplication. A couple generations go by, a period of time elapses. And I don't have this on the screen, but if you look at verse 5 of Exodus chapter 1, it says when all of Joseph's family, when his father Jacob and all his brothers and their brothers' kids, when they came into Egypt, there were 70 males. Some of them were little kids, but 70 males total. And then by the time that they leave in the Exodus, if you go to Numbers chapter 1, verse 46, when they count the people after they're at Mount Sinai, just the young men who are fighting age, so from age 20 to whatever, the Bible doesn't give precisely, if that be 55, 60, whatever a man could be on frontline duty in combat, whatever that age is, just those age of fighting men is over 600,000. So that's not even counting little kids. They're not even counting men who are too old to fight. And so they're in Egypt for 430 years. So mathematically, to go from 70 to over 600,000, you have to double. So, say you got a mom and a dad, and they have 4 kids. That's the minimum you can do to double, go from 2 people to 4 people. You have to double every generation 14 times in a row to get from 70 to over 600,000. So when the Bible says that God blessed them and they multiplied, and you imagine the challenge this would be to support a family and slavery and all the oppression, everything going on. So we see this was a divine blessing, but it's also it is God fulfilling his promise. As Pastor Howard's been talking about in Genesis, God promised Abraham, I will make your people a great nation. And this is God fulfilling that exactly. So much that the people are afraid. The Hyksos were afraid of them. The Egyptians were afraid of them, of how quickly they were multiplying. And we know ultimately, we know the whole story. This is not really Egyptians' policy. This is Satan behind the throne. He's wanting to eradicate Abraham's seed because God promised through Abraham would come the Messiah and it would come the redemption for all the world. So he wants to kill Jesus before he's even born, essentially, is what's going on. So, but verse 20, the midwives disobey, the people multiply, time goes on, and so then it would seem verse 22 is another Pharaoh. So then Pharaoh, they changed their policy again. So Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. So now it's not just to the midwives, it's a broad, nationwide policy. He commands all the people, hey, you see any Hebrew infant boys, toss them into the river, kill them. It's just open season, essentially, on Hebrew people. And so, who is this next Pharaoh? Is that Pt1 the first? Possibly. It would kind of fit with him and his personality. He was a military commander. He expanded Egypt quite a bit during his time, expanded into the land of Palestine, expanded south into Africa, into the land of Nubia. And so it would make sense. Someone who's arrogant, who's had success on the battlefield would give such a bloody command as this here. And so, but then Moses is going to be born, and so it's going to get complicated. And I will try to explain this as best I can. So Pt1 the first, it's tough because all these guys got the same name. So Pt1 the first, he is going to have all the Egyptian pharaohs had multiple wives. That was just a common thing that they did. I'm not endorsing it, but that's what they did. And so, so he's going to have his son, Pt1 the second, by one wife. He's going to have a daughter, Hatshepsut, by another wife. Now, the Egyptians had this really weird thing where, because they are God, they are descended from God, that you can't dilute the divine bloodline. And so they would do incest. They would marry your brother, your sister, your half-sister, all these things. And it's weird, and they paid the price for it. We dig up the pharaohs and the mummies, and you do genetic tests on the mummies, and they had some major problems going on there from all their genetic inbreeding and the deals that happened there with that. So Pt1 the first is going to force his son, Pt1 the second, to marry his half-sister, Hatshepsut. And that's just what they did, keep the bloodline pure for Pharaoh. Well, it's very possible, because this is going to be right at the time when Moses is born, and so it's very possible that Hatshepsut is going to be who the daughter of Pharaoh that is named there in Exodus chapter 2, verse 5, who's going to rescue Moses out of the river. We don't know 100%. The Bible doesn't name any of these people here, but what is taking place here is that Hatshepsut is, so she's married to her half-brother. However, her half-brother has, she's just one wife among many that her half-brother has. And so he has a son by another wife, and he chooses that son, Pt1 the third, to be his heir. So Hatshepsut, she's the queen, but she knows that her offspring is not going to inherit the throne. And it's very likely that as a young woman, being in that situation, that she finds a Hebrew baby floating in the river, and she knows, hey, I have an opportunity here to adopt an heir of my own and maybe take the throne through this. Hatshepsut's an ambitious woman. She becomes Pharaoh herself later on, and so that's very possible. Again, we don't know. Maybe it was her. It may have been her daughter who did this. But this is the political climate in the background. It may not have been any of these women, but it was some daughter of Pharaoh who very likely wanted to try to adopt an heir for a chance to get the throne, and that's why Moses' life gets saved. Verse 5, chapter 2, it says, Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. Her maidens walked along the riverside, and when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, This is one of the Hebrews' children. And so now whatever her plan was with Moses, if this was even her, it doesn't come to pass. Moses does not become Pharaoh or anything. Now, what does happen is that her husband, Tutmos II, dies when his other son, Tutmos III, the next heir, is 2 years old. So Hatshepsut seizes the throne herself, and she becomes Pharaoh for 20 years. She dresses male like a pharaoh. All her obelisks and everything are in the male form, as if she is a pharaoh there, and she's going to rule during that time. And it was very confusing for archaeologists when they first found it, because all the it was talking about Pharaoh, but all the pronouns were feminine. And they're like, what on earth is this? And, so they finally figured out who this was. And so, she's a woman of ambition, and very likely could have been this individual in the Bible. Verse 10, so Moses is raised by his own mother until he is done weaning. So age 2 or 3, maybe even older. They wean children older back then. But verse 10 says, and the child grew, and she, Moses' mother, Jochebed, brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, because I drew him out of the water. Now, this is one of those things. The Bible's just very matter of fact, like, yeah, she just gave him to Pharaoh's daughter. I mean, this is a super emotional deal. If you can imagine being a mom, that you've raised your own kid you've given birth to, and you're just going to hand him over to somebody else after a couple of years. But this is what happens, and God was going to take care of him. And so it says he became her son, so she called him, the pronouns she. Who is that? Who's naming Moses? Is it his own biological mother, or is it Pharaoh's daughter? We don't know exactly, but it would seem to be Pharaoh's daughter, though, being the fact that Moses is a couple years old when he gets his name at this point. So he's getting adopted into the Egyptian royal family through this time, and so he receives an Egyptian name, and that would line up with what we know about Egypt and their vocabulary. So if you take the name Moses and you chop the S off the end, you get Mose, or M-O-S-E. And Mos. And you see that in all kinds of Egyptian names at that time. Amos, Tutmos. Amos means one born of the moon god that the Egyptians worship. Tutmos means one born of the god of wisdom. Very likely Moses, his original name was not Moses, but his name was actually Hapmos, which means one born of the Nile. The Egyptians worshipped the Nile god Hapi, H-A-P-I, and so Moses, he would have been originally Hapmos, and then the New Testament gives us the explanation. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 24, says, by faith Moses, when he became of age, when he gets 40 years old, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. So a lot of times we think in the life of Moses that, well, he meant well, and then he accidentally killed the Egyptian when he was trying to help his people, and then that's when Moses had to flee, and that's when things took place for his life. But the New Testament gives us a bit more detail. Actually, Moses made a deliberate decision. When he turned 40 years old, he made a decision to not be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And with the Egyptian naming of all your Mose, son of, and son of whatever god, Moses, by refusing to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, in the royal family, he's got a piece of divinity with him. He's part of the divine bloodline. And so refusing that is giving up his claim to divinity, giving up his claim to let a pagan god use his name, and giving up the royal prestige and all the privileges that came with being royalty. So very likely he was called Hapmos as a kid, and then he changed it. When he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, he dropped off the pagan name there at the beginning, and he just went by Moses after that. And then the book of Hebrews continues in verse 25 and 26 about Moses choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Sin feels good at first, but it's only temporary there, certainly. Verse 26, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. That picture there, that is our most famous pharaoh of all, Pharaoh Tutankhamun, or King Tut, as he's called. He is also part of the 18th dynasty. He's later on in the 18th dynasty. And he was a very minor pharaoh, only reigned for a couple years, but he's famous to us because his tomb was uncovered intact, the only one so far. with that. All the other pharaohs, their tombs, the pyramids, had been broken into or raided hundreds of years before, but they found Tutankhamun's tomb, and he was buried in not one, but two solid gold sarcophagus there around his mummy. And so, if that's the kind of wealth that they would put for a minor pharaoh who did not reign very long, to give him two gold sarcophagus, what kind of wealth he has, because again, in their belief, you need all this stuff in the afterlife. What could Moses have had during the peak of Egypt's power? There, the riches that he gave up, that's what it says there, verse 26, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. And they had a lot of treasures, for sure, but Moses turned away that privilege of the royalty instead to suffer there with God's people. And so, just two more slides, and then we'll wrap here. So, Moses is going to, when he turns 40, he's going to refuse to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, and he wants to help his people. That was in his heart. We see that if you read Stephen's sermon in Acts chapter 7, talks about Moses wanted to deliver the people when he was 40. It wasn't God's time, and God still needed to prepare him. And so Moses is going to try to help his people, and there's going to be an Egyptian slave master. Moses is going to murder this Egyptian, and from that he's going to have to flee. Verse 15 of Exodus chapter 2, when Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. So who is this Pharaoh in verse 15? It doesn't say, but it's very likely this guy named Thutmose III. Now, he was the little kid when Hatshepsut took the throne, and later when he's in his 20s, he's going to become sole ruler when Hatshepsut dies, and he's not going to be very happy with Hatshepsut keeping him on the sidelines all during his youth. And so he's going to, as far as we can tell, do a deliberate policy of erasing her from history. So everywhere where her little symbol was chiseled onto obelisks and everything like that, it gets smoothed away or it gets broken off. And so, again, we don't know. There's no records of Moses outside the Bible in Egyptian history, but that could be intentional. That could be because if Moses was the adopted son of Hatshepsut, well, if they erased Hatshepsut, guess who else gets erased? Moses gets erased there. So that would have certainly happened. And we can see whoever the Pharaoh was, they would have been very happy with this circumstance with Moses and murdering the Egyptian to get rid of this rival to the throne and get rid of this potential challenger here. And so Moses has to flee. Now, Thutmose III, he is going to lead Egypt, the ancient Egyptian empire, to their climax, to the zenith, where they are at the height of their territory, the height of their influence. He's going to, what secular historians call him, the Napoleon of Egypt. He led 16 military campaigns over 20 years, and you can see there the green area of what he expanded Egypt's territory more than it ever had been before. He went through the land of Canaan, that Egypt had conquered that, all the way up there in the north, all the way to the Euphrates River, which the Egyptians referred to as the river that runs backwards, because to them the Nile goes north and the Euphrates goes south. So they were puzzled by that. How can you have a river that goes south? But that's what they thought of it. And so what the Bible says, though, verse 15, that Moses, he fled from the face of Pharaoh, dwelt in the land of Midian, Now, Midian is going to be what's on that map there, the land, the white there in Arabia, so the little Sinai Peninsula over the Gulf there from that. So that's why does Moses have to get so far? Well, it's because Egypt is really big, and this is the biggest they've ever been, and this is the height of their jurisdiction. So Moses has to go a long ways to get away from anyone who's trying to hunt him down there in Egypt. So that's what he does, and finally gets away. However, at the end of chapter 2, this Pharaoh, if it's Thutmose III or whoever it is, again, we don't know exactly, but whoever it is going to die. Verse 23, it says, now it happened in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. Then the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry came up to God because of the bondage. So verse 23 says, it happened in the process of time. So that indicates that this is a long period of time that it takes for this Pharaoh to die. Many of these pharaohs at this time, they'd reign 14 years, a dozen years, something like that. Thutmose III is going to be the exception to that. He is going to reign, he started at age 2, but he's going to reign 54 years. So that would kind of make sense with what the Bible's saying, that it took a long time. Moses got to hang out in the wilderness 40 years waiting on Pharaoh to die. Well, if Thutmose III is living for 54 of those years, that lines up exactly with what the Bible says, that what has to take place. For it takes a long time for the Pharaoh who didn't like him to die before he's free to go back to the land of Egypt. And so that could have been exactly what that was about. At the end of that verse, says the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage. So Egypt's at the height of its power. And empires are built on the back of slaves very often. And so it's going to take a lot of slavery to prop up that empire. And so that's going to be very tough on the people. Thutmose III is known for building the temple of Karnak. If you ever go to Egypt, there's the big pyramids, there's Giza, go there, go to Karnak. That's what, they got the huge temple. It looks really small there from an aerial view, but it is massive. It's larger than life. Obelisks everywhere, Egyptian history recorded everywhere, chiseled into the columns and into the pillars. And so he put a lot of effort into that. Karnak is way south of where Goshen is. So probably didn't have any Hebrew slaves on that, but the Hebrews were just one part of many of the slaves that the Egyptians had control over. But we could see the oppression there that would have taken place. And so whoever this Pharaoh is, verse 23, Thutmose III, whoever, he's going to die, and Thutmose III has a son, Amenhotep II, who might have been the Pharaoh of the Exodus. We don't know. No, we'll see. We'll look at that more in detail. But whatever it is, God arranged the pieces where, Egypt's at the height of its power, but God is going to use Moses and going to use the miracles to bring them to their knees. And all we have our powerful gods and we're the most powerful nation in the world. Well, they are going to crumble under the 10 plagues and everything. So whenever we pick up next in this series, we'll look at that. The Nile god, the frog god, the different ones that the people worshipped there, and the true God showing his power through that. So we'll wrap up there. Any questions, anything before we come to an end? So, okay. All right, well, if you got your prayer list, if you notice, we have 2 more sections of buildings out there. So we have 6 out of the 8 that we are aiming for. So we're happy to have that. And no updates that I'm aware of on the permit or anything. Everyone's still recovering from Thanksgiving break and whatever, so we'll see if we can get some movement on that, hopefully in the next week or so. I do remember some of our many needs mentioned on here, especially Gary Marine McDaniel, that Brother Gary's brother was found unconscious at their home in Albuquerque, and then later he did pass away, so that's where they are with family for the funeral arrangements. And is there any update on John Till, Brother Dale? He's still working through therapy. Yeah. So many of those. And so we're just going to pass the mic around. I'm going to ask everyone who can to stand. Yes, Sarah? Yeah.
There was a teen that was shot at Pecan Creek South.
Okay.
So just pray for that family.
Okay, sure. Pecan Creek South. So, yeah. A dangerous place, yes. So, so pray for that. There's a lot of, lots of stories of troubled youth that we've been hearing from different church friends.